como a Monolith Soft, né? A Monolith Soft transformou a Nintendo. Tem legenda em portuguesinho? Pra nós. Tem a tradução de uma legenda manual, então já fica competente. Vamos lá, assistir aqui. Ô, Mef, muito obrigado por mandar o vídeo e muito obrigado novamente por comprar prioridade da fila, né? Tá legendado em português na moral, galera. Fiquem tranquilos. E é um tema que eu acho interessante, tá? Porque eu gosto da Monolith Soft, que é uma empresa de jogos que faz alguns jogos para Nintendo. Vamos ver.
Earlier in the year, in response to the huge acquisitions of Bethesda and Activision by Microsoft and Bungie by Sony, Nintendo's president stated at an investor presentation that they weren't interested in the same kind of approach. For them, it was more important that they only bring in people with, quote, Nintendo DNA. For sure, that matches up with their...
É incrível como a Nintendo consegue ser uma empresa incrível. É incrível que a empresa é incrível. Com jogos, mas horrível com todo o resto de relação com o jogador, né? Eles fazem jogos incríveis, mas tem a pior relação com os jogadores possíveis. Tipo, de foder com o emulador, processo, acabar com todo... Cara, é bizarro, né? É a dualidade do ser humano.
Track records. Their most recent acquisition was SRD, a support studio that had already been working out of their offices. But Monolith Soft, whom Nintendo acquired from Bandai Namco in 2007, decidedly has very little of what most would consider to be that Nintendo DNA. These are the Xenogears, the Xenosaga lot, and over their 22 years of game creation, they've found their own identity that people still consider distinct from the creators of Mario. At the time, it was Shinji Hatano's call, the then general manager of Nintendo licensing. The founders of Monolith had left Square upon realizing that they'd never have the freedom to make something like Xenogears again. And after finding a safe haven at Namco, they later found their projects cancelled and advocates leaving during the merger with Bandai. And so, Shinji Hatano offered to whisk the company away to Nintendo, with the premise that they should make games that nobody else can, not even the prestigious company they now worked for. Monolith today still remains the exception to the Nintendo DNA, but that hasn't stopped them from infecting each other. Monolith takes what they need from Nintendo, while Nintendo takes what they need from Monolith. The result? Both companies get something to brag about.
Eu preciso jogar muitos jogos ainda.
Video is sponsored by. In the late 90s, Tetsuya Takahashi and his wife's Final Fantasy VII pitch had been rejected. Deemed too dark and complicated, they were instead given the permission to develop it into a new game, Xenogears. To
É do Final Fantasy? Ah, tá.
Final Fantasy VII pitch had been rejected. Deemed too dark and complicated, they were instead given the permission to develop it into a new game, Xenogears. To Xenoblade fans, the concept is familiar. There are mechs, a shady church, a secret truth behind the world, and a monolith with unfathomable power. It was a success, both critically and commercially.
Esse foi um jogo que eu tinha, o Piratex, o Falseta, pra PlayStation 1, mas eu não joguei. Eu joguei, eu vi um robô, eu não quis mais jogar. Mas eu me arrependo disso hoje em dia. Eu gostaria de ter jogado e eventualmente eu quero jogar.
Beautiful game made by some of Square's greatest talents. But at the time, Square was more interested in expanding the Final Fantasy series.
Final Fantasy é meio overrated, pra falar a verdade.
So, they left.
Gosto muito, mas o povo exagera muito. Importantes, famosos, bons, divertidos. Mas é como se só existe JRPG? Só existe Final Fantasy.
Artists who had worked on Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, Romancing Saga. It was a big loss. Almost 20 years later, in 2006, Monolith Soft had become a busy creative place. In the boardrooms, they were preparing to be acquired by Nintendo. On the development floor, they were working hard on their first Wii title, while also launching their third Xenosaga game. And then, in a different room entirely, unbeknownst to most of the company's staff, one of the studio's founders was building a scale model of two giants locked in battle. Monolith's Yasuyuki Hone believes that there was more than just one way to explain your ideas, and so from wires, clay and paper mache, he built not just the pitch for Xenoblade Chronicles, but its world as well. Open world games are...
Legal o cara ter feito uma miniatura em papel machê. Os caras são muito doidos, né?
Kind of ubiquitous these days. Elden Ring, Horizon, Dying Light, Assassin's Creed. But even after a decade and a half of...
Eu vi que a galera ficou bolada que eu falei que Final Fantasy é overrated. Desculpa, gente, eu acho que é. Não... Overrated não significa ruim. Não significa que não teve impacto. Mas se o impacto foi 100 na indústria e o povo fala que foi 2000, isso é overrated, entendeu? Tô falando que as pessoas perdem a mão. E acha que só Final Fantasy existe como JRPG. E eu... Ah, você conhece um monte de JRPG, isso aqui é porque vocês são um monte de nerd. Mas, pra muita gente, só existe Final Fantasy JRPG. Isso que eu falo que é overrated. Os caras, tipo, as pessoas só ligam pra isso. Esquecem de todos, esquecem de Xenogears, esquece de Breath of Fire, esquece de Suikoden, esquece de tudo. Só existe Final Fantasy. Você fala de outros jogos... Não, só existe Final Fantasy. Esse que é o problema. Né? Dragon Quest, ninguém lembrava de Dragon Quest até sair os mais novos agora. A Fire Emblem já é um pouco diferente. Né? Já é Tactics.
Incredible games, there's still never been anything quite as exciting.
Narra está mordido porque é fanboy de Breath of Fire 4. Fato, Breath of Fire 4 é melhor do que Final Fantasy VII, isso é óbvio. Qualquer um que jogou os dois sabe como Breath of Fire é algo muito melhor mecanicamente do que Final Fantasy. Mas tudo bem, isso é outra discussão. Não quero roubar minha cabeça, cortar minha cabeça. Mas eu estou nervoso porque Breath of Fire é da Capcom. Uhul! Yeah! O Breath of Fire 5 foi complicado, tem coisa boa, mas é muito complicado. Breath of Fire 6 foi um jogo mobile e a franquia morreu! Aê!
As being told that you get to explore these two giants. Hone had
então eu sempre vou ficar bolado com Final Fantasy porque é inveja. Final Fantasy viveu. Meu Breath of Fire morreu. Para que vocês pudessem andar.
Employees trying out multiple poses to help him imagine what parts could be the flat plains, where would the cold areas be, where would be the best place for a starting town. It wasn't exactly the same as the game that would release 4 years later, but it was pretty damn close. At E3 2009, the game was announced as...
Eu lembro que em 2011 ou 2010, eu mandei um e-mail para Capcom. Deixa eu ver. Mandei um e-mail pra Capcom. Porra, não tá nesse e-mail, tá no outro. Deixa eu ver se eu acho. Eu mandei um e-mail pra Capcom perguntando se Breath of Fire ia voltar. Deixa eu ver se eu acho. Oh, porra. Se a senha do e-mail não vai dar pra olhar agora. Mas eu mandei o e-mail deles pra eles perguntando: Breath of Fire vai voltar? Perguntando, né? Tipo, olá, sou fã do jogo, joguei muito tempo, Breath of Fire 4. Vocês têm vontade de fazer um remake? Tá nos planos? E eles me responderam. A Capcom me respondeu. Eles falaram: não está nos planos.
Monado, beginning of the world, before Nintendo later retitled it Xenoblade in honor of Tetsuya Takahashi's work on Xenogears and Saga. And while it took some effort from dedicated fans to get it to the United States after enjoying a limited European release, it eventually met critical acclaim, as has every game they've released since. My history with Xenoblade has been a bit of a weird one. The original game was a constant presence on a shelf in my local game store, selling for a whopping 120 Australian dollars. It was totally out of reach, but even then, just from looking at the back cover, it had the best visuals of any Nintendo Wii game I'd seen. But I finally got the chance to play a Xeno game after the announcement of something simply called X at E3 2013. I was enamored. It had mechs, just like the anime I liked.
Esse jogo eu sempre fico morrendo de vontade de jogar.
It had a Hiroyuki Sawano soundtrack, just like the anime I liked. And it was on the new Wii U console, just like the anime I liked. Xenoblade Chronicles was special in that every body part was a different part of the map, and it felt like that. You look off into the distance and you can tell, hey, I'm on a knee. But instead of standing on the literal shoulders of giants, Xenoblade Cross took things a bit more down to earth, or in this case, to mirror. This was
Esse jogo era bom? Eu sempre fiquei morrendo de vontade de jogar ele, até hoje eu não joguei.
Their first true open world title, and they
Wii U, hein?
had to scale back a bit from their original plans. Nintendo wanted to push Monolith, but as their first HD open world title, the studio leadership wanted to make sure to still work within their means, which also included no overtime work. So despite being their largest world to date, Mirror is smaller than they'd initially planned, and they'd even considered having multiple planets to explore. But what we have instead is a focused alien world that's a delight to traverse. Xenoblade games have always sought to encourage the pioneering spirit, with secret areas, side quests and plenty of items to find. But it's not like they need them, especially here on Mirror. The fields look like no other fields I've seen in games, as does the city, the forest, the beaches. Wherever you go, it feels alien, living up to the Xeno in its title. My strongest memory is walking into Noctilum for the first time, seeing that luminescent flora and thinking, I didn't know games could look this good. And of course, Cross wasn't exactly a technical marvel. They had a tight budget and were working on the inferior Wii U hardware. But Monolith has a knack for making whatever console they're working on look more powerful than it actually is. That was true for the Nintendo
Direção de arte e técnicas inteligentes de renderização, né?
Wii, the Wii U, and now the Switch. In all honesty, I don't think I ever finished Xenoblade Cross. I have strong memories of exploring all over the world for hours on end, but I didn't get all that far in the story. I don't even think I got the mech, which was the reason I bought the game to begin with. It's one of the titles I would most like to see get a port to the Switch, but as Takahashi himself has noted, the task would be both arduous and expensive. As we've recently seen with Definitive Edition, the studio doesn't take remasters lightly, preferring to essentially rebuild them, rather than just port them over wholesale. But even without Cross, the Switch ended up being the place for Monolith to cement their legacy, and more importantly, their value. A console launch is a big deal for any company, but
a gente viu um vídeo sobre a waifuzação de Xenogears, Xenoblade, né? Realmente foi.
Monolith was doing some serious heavy lifting. In 2017, they released Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the true follow-up to their landmark 2010 release. It featured a new character designer expelled from Paradise's Masatsugu Saito, a new combat system, and now, instead of just two titans, the game was based around nations that have settled on several beasts, orbiting the mysterious world tree. Monolith has never had a particularly easy time developing their ambitious titles. It's why they generally try and only do one at a time. But Xenoblade 2 was particularly difficult. Monolith's Tokyo office had 100 employees, but during development, 50 to 60% of them were actively helping Nintendo with their own Switch title. You may have heard of it. It's one of the greatest games of all time.
Game of the Year goes to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Você vê, né, que nem a Nintendo conseguiu usar o hardware deles, eles tiveram que chamar ajuda dos outros caras que sabiam usar o hardware deles.
Monolith has been intimately involved in Nintendo games development since they were acquired, but that went an extra step further when they established Monolith Kyoto, a team of expert 2D and 3D artists who could be summoned at the publisher's request. But unlike most outsourcing, Nintendo recognizes the value of this team as creative people, not just Dog's Body. For instance, Monolith staff created a lot of the art for Animal Crossing New Horizons, both Splatoon titles and Pikmin 3.
Os caras são basicamente, então, a divisão zero da Nintendo, né? Nintendo precisa fazer um negócio bom, chama eles.
And it's really not minor. Almost half
Isso
of
tá aqui da onde? Da Austrália, se eu não me engano, que ele falou ali.
the Splatoon 2 art team was from Monolith, and most of Animal Crossing's visuals were created by this team too. But the general logic has been that Nintendo and Monolith operate too differently for the Xenosaga veterans to take on proper game design roles. That's why Kyoto Studio is made up of artists. Nintendo tells them what kind of thing they're looking for, and the devs then contribute their own ideas. That kind of back and forth is probably happening right now for Splatoon 3. But when the Zelda team were looking to scale up and tackle an open world, they didn't just need artists, they needed people experienced in creating large cohesive fields. So while Kyoto Studio was making Splatoon 2, half of Tokyo Studio was creating Breath of the Wild's award-winning open worlds. One of the big things the Monolith team had learned from their time on Xenoblade was the idea of visible progression. As you climb up the Bionis, every time you look out into the distance, you start to see the Mechonis from different angles. No matter what you're up to, it's a constant reminder of how you're doing. At the same time, in Breath of the Wild, Hyrule Castle is a constant and present threat, seen from far distances. But even when you're properly far out, you can at least still see the Divine Beast's lasers. The world is reminding you that you're not only still in the same world as Hyrule Castle, but also that you're one step closer to freeing it from Calamity Ganon's grasp. In the end, it's my theory that the world of Breath of the Wild, as well as the worlds of the games it inspired, Elden Ring, Genshin Impact, Pokémon Legends,
Não foi inspiração em Genshin Impact, vamos ser sinceros aqui, né? Foi outra coisa.
their creative lineage began with Xenoblade.
You need only take me with you to the foot of the Erd Tree.
Even though they lost half of their development team to Zelda,
Nossa.
Takahashi's team kept Xenoblade 2 alive through the use of a large number of outsourcing partners, and Nintendo's strict quality assurance meant that they never felt like they had to release anything that was less than polished. As we saw in Xenoblade Cross, Takahashi's policy was that if you're going to go on an adventure in a game, it was better to have locations that you wouldn't be able to see anywhere else.
Verdade.
So Xeno 2 ended up having even more different kinds of environments that each have their
Aventura,
own
né?
logic and stories. An ice country with a specific reason for its
Isso ajuda muito. A gente não percebe muito essas coisas, mas isso ajuda na nossa, não só na imersão do jogo, mas também em como o nosso cérebro funciona na hora de se acostumar ou entediar. Essas quebras ajudam a gente a renovar o nosso interesse, por mais que outras coisas não mudem. Então, você vai ver isso em vários tipos de história, música e tal, quando você quebra o padrão e visual ou algum tipo de padrão para você voltar a prestar atenção naquilo de alguma forma.
climate, a dying geothermal titan that's burning out. Each of these nations of All Rest went on to develop their own cultures,
Genshin Impact só capou, copiou e esvaziou o conceito. Sim. Só que também eles, como eu posso dizer? A execução para um jogo de graça mobile que rodasse em vários celulares, quando você leva isso em consideração, ainda é incrível o que eles fizeram. Apesar de que sim, em Zelda tudo aquilo é melhor, porque você tem pilares de game design muito mais saudáveis do que um gacha. Mas a execução dentro de um gacha, dentro de um jogo free, com pilares negativos de um jogo free, ainda assim é impressionante.
separate from each other, which inspired the developers to work with the localization team to cast each with their own respective dialect counterpart, whether that's English, Scottish, American, or Welsh catgirls. The team is in love with their worlds, and while they recognise that you can totally just blaze through the main story, they want you to explore, to do the side quests, to meet the people. Torna won't even let you finish the game without doing a few dozen errands. It's important to them that you understand the world you're trying to save. Ultimately, Xeno 2 is a girl meets boy story, but in typical Xenoblade fashion, it's also a story about the world and the people within it. With Xenoblade Chronicles 2 and Torna, Monolith made the Nintendo Switch look good. In fact, that's kind of the goal for first-party developers. Sure, they should be selling games, but their larger role is in making the console seem appealing to both players and developers. The debut of Xenoblade 2 was at the first Nintendo Switch presentation after all. It's always seems like Monolith has a better handle on Nintendo hardware than even Nintendo themselves.
Exato, que a gente comentou. E não é que parece. Eu acho que hein? Eu acho que os caras são os que realmente manjam de usar o software da Nintendo. Deve ter alguns caras muito cabeça na Monolith.
They push it to the limits, and then, knowing that the frame rate won't be all that impressive, create a visual style and combat system that won't be all too affected by it.
Exatamente.
Sure, it'd be lovely to see the team develop for a PS5, but right now, they're happy just making lemonade. When they released Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition last year, they took the opportunity to show off. Not only does it refine the visuals so thoroughly that it looks even better than 2, but in the additional future connected storyline, they let the player collect pond spectres, who will follow you around on your adventure. Thereby they proved that not only can Monolith show a truly beautiful large open world on the Switch, but they've optimized it so well that they can throw 12 more bouncy characters on screen. Xenoblade games have never sold particularly well by Nintendo standards, but it is heartwarming to see the series continue. Monolith has never been forced to make a Waluigi world or Birdo's Big Adventure game. They're a Nintendo company, but making exactly the kind of thing they want to make. As a reward for helping to make the Switch's best games, I think they've more than earned it. When I planned this video in January, this was originally going to be the end, but then a Nintendo Direct dropped with an announcement that blew my mind. So, let's talk about Xenoblade 3 a little.
Eu tenho um amigo completamente viciado em Xenoblade e eu quero ser viciado em Xenoblade, só que, infelizmente, eu trabalho.
Monolith couldn't have made a game like Xenoblade Cross early on.
Tipo, eu quero eventualmente diminuir a quantidade de trabalho que eu tenho pra estudar. Estudar significa jogar isso aqui.
In the Wii U's life cycle. At the same time, I doubt they could have made a game like Xenoblade 3 back in 2017 either. Ionios is beautiful. The worlds of 1 and 2 have come together to create something more than the sum of their parts. We've only seen a brief look so far, but what we have seen is stunning. An evolution of everything they've created thus far, but still with that yearn for originality. And this is likely with a portion of their team off helping create the new floating world of Hyrule. The monolith in their logo is based on the one in 2000.
Não tem como emular isso não? O povo tá falando de comprar Switch, Wii U e tal. Não tem como emular essa parada não?
One a Space Odyssey, a mysterious machine that triggers unforeseen evolution. And you know what? I think they've lived up to that. Thanks for watching The Caniper Effect. This is a video I wanted to make immediately after finishing Xenoblade Definitive Edition.
Muito bom. Jogar em live pode ser uma opção legal, né? Só não sei se eu iria fazer anúncio dessas lives, porque são lives que não sei se são tão interessantes pra todo mundo.